Welcome to the Raising Cinephiles podcast, a show about passing on your love of cinema to the next generation. I'm your host, Jessica Kantor, and I have worked in all facets of the entertainment industry for the last 20 years, and recently became a mom. Always remember that myself and guests are speaking from personal experience and not giving parenting advice. Let's go ahead and dive into the episode. Today, we're here with Yalda Uhls, who is a founder of the Center of Scholars and Storytellers, which is an organization dedicated to bringing science and entertainment media with the goal of maximizing the positive effects of media on youth. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start us off with our first question. What is your first movie memory?
It's not a great one. I think my parents took me to a drive-in when I was way too young, and we watched a horror movie, and I remember being terrified. It might have been something like Little Shop of Horrors, or because I remember some plant ate something. But that is my very first movie memory.
That sounds terrifying. Do you remember kind of around how old you were? You were
probably around 4 or 5.
And do you have older siblings?
I did not.
Okay.
I was the oldest.
You're the oldest. And so what's your first happy movie memory?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, my parents only let me watch 1 hour of television a week. And they are academics. They were not cinephiles. So I think my first happy movie memory was in high school. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say it, but I was stoned. I grew up in Berkeley. And I sat in the first row watching the movie The Jerk with Steve Martin. And I laughed and laughed and laughed. And it was like cinema became my love. My friends actually, and then my brother was just visiting me, they say that all I do is connect real life to something that happened in a movie. This is just like blah, blah. This is just...
I feel like I do that too. But, wait, is art imitating life or life imitating art?
Yeah, exactly.
So you weren't allowed to watch much media growing up, which your parents were ahead of their time. I feel like that's becoming a bigger theme that I'm hearing than sort of the Waldorf upbringing of no screens.
Well, I can tell you it backfired with me because, first of all, I felt like a loser. Media is how young people connect.
Yeah.
And then I went into the film business. So I was a movie executive. I became obsessed with films. And I was a movie executive for over 15 years, senior vice president of MGM. And then when I stepped off and I got a PhD, so I have a PhD in developmental psychology, I then decided to study how media impacts youth. So ultimately, I've spent my entire life in media. And it's like, don't give them any sugar. And then, as soon as they can, they're going to crave sugar and overdose on it.
I grew up with a TV in my room and love television and movies and work in the business as well. And I couldn't watch anymore. So I don't know. I think there are people who just love it and people who don't. I definitely think for me, it was a lot about it being a safe place to feel all the feelings.
Absolutely. And it's also a place, so now I study it, right? Mm-hmm. So I understand what kids learn both positively and negatively from both traditional media, audiovisual media, as well as social media, and gaming and all. I know all the research. I've been studying it for now almost 15 years. And there is, it's a place in particular for audiovisual, and this is for books too. Mm-hmm. It's a place where you learn social norms, you learn the rules of society outside of your immediate environment. And it's really, really important because, and that's why, and, I'm sure you, like many, many other people, obviously Breakfast Club was another, touchstone. Mm-hmm. All of those movies with the Brat Pack, I loved, About Last Night. These things really are incredibly foundational in learning about the world. And I think the reason so many people remember these powerful moments in their teenage years around media is because we're trying to figure out the world, and media becomes such an important piece of that.
Yeah. My son is still quite young, and I'm slowly introducing him to media and stories of all sorts, audio, visual, books. And it's amazing how he's learning about behavior from it. He's potty curious. We're not potty training just yet. And he became obsessed with books about potty training to learn
Mm-hmm.
how to do it, about characters that he could see himself in, which I think is, it's just so, I'm a big advocate of media, as you can tell
Me
that
too.
I have a podcast for it. I think in the world can be used for both positive and negative. So I'm going to step back a little bit and ask you, you fell in love with cinema from Steve Martin's The Jerk. When did you know you wanted to, like, was that the moment you knew you wanted to work in media, or was there another
Oh no.
moment?
Oh no. I mean, I was just someone who enjoyed it. I went to Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
I was never aware that there was a career in the movie business. But right after college, I got a MBA at UCLA, and that's the first time I become aware that, oh my God, there's people that actually make movies, and not just the actors and not just the directors. There's people that work with those people. And so when I was in business school, I started doing internships at various places. And that led to me basically becoming a movie executive. And it's so funny because my parents were such snobs and, so academic. And I was like, I'm going into pop culture. But of course, eventually they became very proud of me because, I got to make some really cool movies.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some of the favorite ones that you made?
None of them huge, which is why I eventually left the studio system because I really like to make, just smaller character pieces. Also,
Mm-hmm.
my mother is a Persian immigrant, and so is my biological father, and so I'm very passionate about diversity, equity, inclusion, and marginalized communities. So I was
Mm-hmm.
always interested in content about different groups of people. So the very first movie I made was called Mi Familia, My
Mm-hmm.
Family, that starred Edgar James Olmos and Jimmy Smits. And it's actually the one I'm very proud of.
Mm-hmm.
It it won awards, and it's and it also speaks to the career I have now, where I'm working at the Center for Scholars and Storytellers. We are based at UCLA, and I'm working to help storytellers craft movies and TV shows and games and music and social media that actually supports young people and helps every young person feel seen. So
Mm-hmm.
another movie I made was Trees Lounge, which starred Steve Buscemi. It was his
Mm-hmm.
first directing film. I made Permanent Midnight, which starred Ben Stiller.
Yeah.
I made Mata, which starred Gabriel Byrne and Patricia Arquette, um, and then a whole bunch of other ones as well.
Yeah. I'm curious, when you're working with projects now at the Center for Scholars and Storytellers, are you working with people at different stages of the story, or are they coming to you with something that's close to finish?
Well, our theory is we work with content that's already out there. So we're going to where teens are.
Mm-hmm.
So we work with Disney, YouTube, Activision, Lego, all sort of the major Mattel, people who are creating content for just everyday teens, and we try to support them. So usually it's either a show that's been greenlit and is already being made, or it's working with the creators, a group of creators who are going to be making content to sort of support them in thinking about different diversity, equity, inclusion issues. We also focus on mental health. So we're working with social media companies, YouTube in particular, and we also focus on social and emotional learning.
Are there any trends that you're noticing in storytelling that needed course correcting or trends that you're really happy to see?
I mean, one trend is there has been more a movement towards giving underrepresented groups more opportunities, both on camera and behind the camera. But it's kind of stalled because when the industry is in fear mode, they revert to what they think has always worked, which is the majority cis white male groups being either in front of the camera and behind the camera. But there is some movement, and there's a growing sort of group of advocacy organizations and people really trying to help storytellers understand the impact their content has.
Mm-hmm.
And Gen Z, which your son is not part of, he's Gen Alpha, but chances are they will be even, unless there's a backlash. But right now, Gen Z is very into social justice.
Mm-hmm.
They are the most diverse generation. They're majority people of color, and they are very, gender fluid. They're very almost half of them identify as not heterosexual.
Mm-hmm.
So there are all these sort of things that Gen Z thinks about that we think about, and they're kind of demanding and that kind of media. And so the industry has to meet them where they are or risk losing them. And many companies have lost them to social media, which feels more authentic to young people. But we're hoping we can convince the traditional storytellers to reflect authentically the lives of modern adolescents, and we have confidence they'll come back.
Have you noticed anything about attention span with the younger generation and just the format of cinema being less interesting to?
There is no real, well, there is actually one researcher who does say she's been studying attention spans for 30 years, and she feels that we aren't, our focus is shorter. But then there is also other studies. Have you ever heard of the marshmallow test?
No.
So that's a very famous study from like maybe 40 years ago where they were studying self-regulation, and self-regulation is a great predictor for future success.
Mm-hmm.
And so they put these very young kids in front of two marshmallows and said, I'm going to leave the room. If you can wait and not eat these, I'll come back and give you 6. And some kids immediately ate them and some were able to wait. And then they followed those kids and found that the kids that were able to wait had better success in life. And there have now been many, many replications of that study, and they've actually found a greater number of kids are able to wait in the modern generations, kind of indicating that this immediate gratification and attention spans are growing. So there's no real research that kind of tells you either way. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of teens who, and all of us who just don't have the patience for movies, but we also have so many options. You know, we used to not have as many options. So we'd watch movies, but now you can watch a 2-minute TikTok video, or you can, binge watch a whole bunch of series that only take 25 minutes of attention at a time. People are fretting that young people can't watch movies. And there is some evidence of that. They don't want to, but it's really more about, I think, the media world expanding and having more choices.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the things that comes up a lot on the podcast, I've had a few parents, some who have kids all different ages, and some who kids love movies from a young age with their parents, and it's an activity they do as a family, and other kids who just reject the idea of film because they're too sensitive, which I think is really interesting, and maybe indicative to where the content has gone. Like it's just not as accessible if you're just really an empathetic person. The structure is to really hit people hard emotionally in films before they kind of resolve an issue. And there just isn't that much content for teenagers in theaters. That's all on.
There isn't, and that's one of the things we'd like to change. So the way the traditional content business works is they pay a lot of attention to preschool content, and they do that because Sesame Street's successful, and Mr. Rogers, and parents control the dial. So, if you feel that it's educational and has good, high quality content, you'll let your kid watch it. And so, when you're making content creators are making preschool content, they consult with child development experts, and they really spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the content is more high quality. But as kids get older, 6 and on, they don't spend any time with developmental psychologists. They don't spend any time thinking about the positive impact of the content. They spend most of their time thinking about engagement and how can you make them laugh and how can you hold their attention. And, sometimes you hold their attention by making quick cuts or loud noises, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're learning anything, either positive or negative from the content. And so we're trying to shift at the Center for Scholars and Storytellers. We're trying to shift and help the industry recognize that this is a very important time. We focus on teens ages 10 to 25, and that this time period is a time where we should be thinking about what the adolescent experience is with media, because first of all, they're using media a lot. And second of all, it's a really important time for brain development. And it is a time where media can be particularly impactful, and they're going to lose their audience if they don't focus on them. So we're also trying to make a business argument. So anyway, these are some of the things that we're trying to do, because in traditional media, they don't think about teens. Tech companies are starting to, but mainly because of regulation and all the public outcry.
Yeah, the technical truth to this is going to be somewhat off, so you may have to correct me, but I was told that for specifically boys ages like 16 to 25 is when their brain repatterns.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true? And if there is some mental health, specifically schizophrenia, that's when it starts to show up?
Well, definitely, yes, boy, yeah, in that age range, that's when they're most susceptible to normal psychology issues. That's when psychosis could arise. And it probably does have something to do with hormones and what's going on in the brain, puberty. And I don't know if media has positive or negative impact on that. I don't think there's any studies showing that, but it is a very critical time. And I'm not sure people can really do anything about that. I mean, genetically, that might happen. I mean, I think there probably are some environmental influences, but what we're finding is, the brain doesn't fully develop till at least 25. And there's a lot of scientists really trying to shift the thinking around adolescence from gloom and doom to a strength-based model, where we're realizing what young people are doing during this age, where we think they do have risky behavior and, they do things with short-term thinking. All of these things are developmentally normal and healthy for them. And if we could think of this period as a place where if they make a mistake, you can still intervene. And this is for marginalized groups, but you can still intervene and help them learn different coping mechanisms or different ways to deal with the world. You can actually change a kid's life. And some of these scientists are thinking about this because there's so many kids that, particular kids of color that get put away for making a mistake, 16, 17, 18, 19 for life. But if you can figure out policies where you can actually get them out and give them support during this time period as they get older than 25, chances are they'll become productive citizens.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's interesting how media could reflect that in some ways for how adults treat kids. Because I think a lot of parents, even when the kids go off to college, they're like, bye, good luck. But those years are just so important for development and can be such a big shift. I've also read some articles about how kids are dropping out after their first year because they don't have enough life skills.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's part of that's helicopter parenting. A lot of parents are too involved, and also kids just don't, we don't let them run out. We don't let them. When I grew up, there was no way to monitor me 24/7. Now we have these ways to monitor our kids and talk to them all the time. And this generation drinks less, smokes less, has sex at a later age, all these things that seem really positive, but it also means they have less sort of life experience. And when they get to college where these things come up, it could be overwhelming.
Yeah. That's really interesting. One of my early episodes with Emily Ziff, which really stuck with me, is she spoke about how she watches some content that's maybe a little television and movies that maybe a little advanced for her tween daughter to be able to
Mm-hmm.
talk through what's happening with the teenagers before she's in those circumstances. So
Exactly.
um,
That's brilliant.
I think it's brilliant. And it's definitely what I hope to do with my son as he grows. He's just learning to speak in sentences. But as he starts consuming and reading and being able to have conversations about how a character's feeling, whether the consequences were right, did they make good choices, do they treat that other person with respect. When you think of John Hughes movies, some of the gender roles and the way that the boys flirt with girls isn't necessarily what I would want my son to do
Right.
today, but it doesn't mean you don't show him it. You speak through it of like, do you, like, negging isn't really the right way to have a girl
Yeah,
like
well,
you.
research shows that the best way for a young person to learn from media is through scaffolding, through adult conversation or parental joint media engagement.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was my habit too, was to, and sometimes you can, if you have a challenging issue with your kid, you can watch something that's around it and you can talk about it through the character
Mm-hmm.
rather than directly through your kid, and they might be more willing to hear that and absorb it. It doesn't feel as I'm the one doing that, even though they may be. Um, and I totally believe I watched 13 Reasons Why with my daughter, and it got a lot of backlash. She brought up things that I know she wouldn't have brought up if she hadn't watched it with me. And it was just a really great show to, sort of have her start thinking about things and thinking about different kinds of issues and then I was there with her so I could help her process it.
Yeah. Which is the kind of most important part. Plus, I think the patterning of knowing you can have those conversations with your parent makes it easier for when there's a real problem for the child to be able to come to you with those problems.
Exactly.
So how old is your you have one child, two children?
I have two children. They're older, 20 and 23.
Do you remember the first films you showed them?
I don't really, but I definitely we watched a lot because I love content. Probably, some animated show. We would watch, Walker and I watched a lot of SpongeBob, and Chloe and well, actually, I loved Caillou. A lot of people hated this show, Caillou, but I loved it because it was actually very developmentally appropriate and very representative of a young child. And then in terms of movies, I do remember I watched Gone with the Wind with my daughter, and she was too young. Like she had a nightmare about the dead bodies later.
Oh.
And then one time we watched Dirty Dancing.
Oh.
She was 9, and I was like, yeah, we'll watch it. And then I forgot all of the deep
Yeah.
things that go on. So I was like, no, it was too late.
You know, I watched it at that age. Dirty Dancing is one of the films that sometimes I ask this question, is like, what movie were you not allowed to watch, but you watched it anyway? I was at a friend's house and her older sister had rented it, and me and my friend woke up before everyone else did so that we could watch it while it was still in the VC. And I remember the heavier parts, and I understood it, but I didn't understand it. Like I understood that there was a baby that wasn't going to come to life, but I didn't really understand beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, you can't developmentally put your brain back to the place it was at different ages. Your learning grows on top of what you've already learned. So it's nearly impossible to know what a young person is taking away. And often they're not taking away what you're taking away. And that goes with so you were talking about morals and themes. It takes a really long time for young people to understand that. And, there are very specific things at each age and stage. At your child's age, they're very susceptible to fear,
Mm-hmm.
and they will focus on the fear-based part of a piece of content and not get the overall message. There's plenty of research on that.
Mm-hmm.
And they really like positive consequences versus negative consequences. It has to be very simplistic. I remember my daughter would watch Dora, and I thought it was really boring, but it was very developmentally appropriate. Barney, with the show Barney, I'm actually in their documentary. That was very developmentally appropriate. But for parents, that song was really challenging. So I'm really glad. I mean, my kids were older when I went back to school, but there are things you can learn about ways that your child can absorb and learn from media. And if you pay attention to that, you can maximize the positive impact.
Yeah, I find, especially with my son right now, that repetition has been amazing.
That's for sure.
He also will just watch YouTube videos of a garbage truck picking up garbage because that's really exciting at the moment. I kind of can't wait till we can get into new media. But there are some shows I've been paying attention to the slower content versus the highly stimulating content, which is the controversy for his age.
Yeah. You think it's too stimulating?
Some of the content, there's been a lot of studies about, say, Cocomelon and how it
Oh yeah.
And there's a lot of media I find that is just too colorful, too loud, too stimulating. And yes, it might give me an extra 20 minutes to drink my coffee. I just don't want my kid to be engaged in that way. There's something about it that makes me nervous.
Well, I mean, you should really just put your son in front of Mr. Rogers. Honestly, there's probably enough of that. And that's one of the best shows ever. There are new pieces of content that are also great. Daniel Tiger's great. I mean, there's a lot of great content. That's the thing. You don't have to put your child in front of, at that age. There's so much good content for young kids. So
yeah.
And this is the thing I want you to think about. And this is really what the American Academy of Pediatrics, every expert that I really trust. And in fact, a study we did found this for adolescents, that parents who have strict time rules on how much media they watch versus strict content rules about the kinds of content, the kids who had parents who had strict time rules had more negative outcomes based on how much media they watch. But the ones who had strict content rules had more positive outcomes. And the reality is, most experts say, pay attention to the content more than the time. Pay attention to the context. What are they actually doing? Are they learning? Are they sitting with you? Are they, or are they watching TikTok when they're at, on the beach? That's not a great thing. They should be playing on the beach, and then pay attention to the child themselves. Some children are indeed more sensitive. There are a lot of children that are very sensitive to the sounds. In a movie theater, it can be really, really loud, and that could be scary and overstimulating. And also, are they in sort of modern tech world, are they using it to communicate and socialize, which hopefully is a positive thing.
Yeah, I love that. And especially for the listeners of my podcast who are people who love story, and what story can do for humanity, just kind of in general, of open your world in general, but to introduce many different cultures. And then also the craft of it as an art. I mean, I think that's what I'm noticing when I'm having these conversations, just the thoughtfulness behind media. And it was interesting, and I'm so happy to be speaking with you because, as someone who writes content, I've been noticing the gap that I want to start working on so that my son has it when he reaches that age, of interesting stories. I think about Stand By, four boys on a journey outside, that's geared towards that age group.
Yeah, it's true.
And there's a lot, the John Hughes films geared towards that age group. And when I grew up, I had Clueless and She's All That, and those kinds of films about teenage relationships that I found really interesting. And teenage sports films I found really interesting growing up. It really stuck with me. And I remember in high school, the film that really stuck with me was called Stealing Beauty, which was...
Oh, I love that movie.
I
was at Cannes with Liv Tyler for that.
Really? Oh, that really, I saw myself in that character. And I think summer after that or before, I went to the south of France to dance with a dance company on my own, which back then you were really on your own. I was 15. And so that feeling of being away and on your own and independent, but not really at the same time, captured that for me, which I thought was just beautiful. And I just don't, I think the stuff that's coming out for that age group is on streaming more than
You know what's so interesting about that movie? So I loved it too. I mean, I literally was my boyfriend at the time represented Liv, so we
uh-huh.
walked, and she was the star of it. And we walked down the red carpet with her at Cannes,
Mm-hmm.
and she was all over Cannes. Like every year, they want some ingenue, beautiful young girl,
Mm-hmm.
and it's such a sexist society. And it was directed by this older man,
Mm-hmm.
Bernardo Bertolucci. Liv reflects back on it, and they just sexualize this young woman to such an extent, and you responded to it and loved it. But like, I wonder, I don't know if you've seen it now, like, and if you think about it with sort of more of today's lens, how you would feel about it. Or if you had a daughter, like, would you really want her to be watching that? What kind of
Yeah.
messages, would she take away from that, as a young teenage girl? But that was directed by an old white man,
Yeah.
Italian man,
Italian man.
like
Yeah.
sexualizing this beautiful young girl in real life and on the screen.
But I was being
There's something creepy about that.
I was being sexualized as a 15-year-old.
Yeah, you were, if you were dancing, for sure.
Right. And so I think there was something about that. And like something I think a lot about when we think about patriarchy, which I think Barbie does a really interesting way of talking about it, is that it's just as bad for the men as it is for the women. And the women, like, we don't even know how much of it is ingrained inside of us.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And,
We've taken it all in. Yeah.
and so I see, like, what she was struggling with, who was the boy that she actually liked, who was good to her kind of struggle to know who she was as a young girl, and how I think wanted people to look at me the way they looked at her, with beauty, like
No,
that,
everybody. That's what they play for,
play
right? I
for,
mean,
right?
yeah.
And so yes, like I like your point 100%, but also like that is because that's where society was when I was watching that movie. Of course I would identify with that character in that way. Yeah, it's so interesting. And and now I wonder if I could even write an honest character without that ingrained in me. I'm sure as a studio executive, you've read plenty of scripts that describe a young ingenue
Yeah,
being,
exactly.
wonder if some of the things that are affecting teenagers right now are being captured in storytelling. An example is, like, I read an article of how Snapchat is really hurting kids' mental health because they can see when their friends are hanging out without them for the location sharing parts. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Totally. Of course.
I mean, that in itself, is such an interesting layer into the teenage relationships of, I couldn't even imagine if I knew everyone got invited to a sleepover, but if I knew for sure, like because there's like data in front of you showing you that you're left out, with the impact and imbalance of that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and also if they've opened it, and I mean, obviously this generation deals with seeing everyone, being seen. There's so many things. I teach a class called Digital Media and Human Development, and we talk about all the normal developmental things that happen during adolescence. You're figuring out intimacy, you're figuring out friends, you're figuring out reputation, all these things. And now you put in social media, and it's a whole nother level of figuring out these things.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Well, I'm going to move us to my last question, which
Okay.
is, if there's one film I should show my son so he falls in love with cinema, and it could be at any age, what film do you think I should show him?
Oh, at any age. Well, I mean, it's really, I wouldn't be able to actually answer that question, because the whole reason we exist, the center and the work that I do is you can't show the same piece of content to a 13-year-old as a 2-year-old or as a 25-year-old. Content is developmentally appropriate and works best when it is right for the right age.
Mm-hmm.
When you first told me about that question, I was thinking, oh, Wizard of Oz, but there's no way I would recommend you put a 2-year-old in front of that.
No.
I mean, obviously, another one I love is the nanny one, Julie Andrews.
Oh, Sound of Music?
No, the nanny.
Oh, Mary Poppins?
Mary Poppins. But, that's too old too. So...
Yeah, but I guess I should rephrase. I mean, you can choose a film for any age, not for him to watch now. Or,
okay.
You know what I mean? So,
no, actually, I'd say Mary Poppins. I love Mary Poppins.
What age do you think is appropriate for?
Probably like 8 or 9.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed the conversation, please don't forget to like and subscribe. New episodes release every Wednesday. And leave a comment and let me know which movie you think I should show my son. Until next time, take care.